Если обращаться к истории в ее полноте, это совокупность биографий всех когда-либо.
If we turn to history in its entirety, this is a collection of biographies of all the people who ever lived. But in this form, history is not available to any of us. Therefore, the question is in which case the selection of facts from history is scientifically consistent, and in which case the selection of facts from the same history is not scientifically consistent. In addition to this, questions arise about the identification of falsification in the historical past. Since Herzen was right when, in the preface to one of his books, he wrote, "We are not allowed to know history yet. The Russian government, as a reverse providence, improves not the future for the better, but the past." This has been the case throughout history. This finds expression in the aphorisms that history is written by the victors, but this applies not only to the victors, the warriors of the state with each other, because why Carthage was bad, we know, not from the point of view of those who lived in Carthage, but from the point of view of the victorious Rome, in which the words, "Carthage must be destroyed," were heard for a long time. But this also applies to internal history, because if Emperor Paul was killed, then this had to be hidden and explained by the fact that Paul was bad. The same applies to evaluations of the death of Peter III, because in order for Catherine to reign in peace, she had to present Peter III as a villain and a madman and show her own virtue. Therefore, the question of how history is falsified is also a very relevant question. From this I began, that historical science, in certain ways, studies what is not in the present, but which has left its traces, which we may know, we may not know, and which we somehow interpret. Traces may be left, but unknown. Well, there may also be traces that are here in front of our own eyes, but we don't perceive them as traces. One example of such a question is the question of the cultural layer in many of our cities. Because if you dig in it, you will find the first floors of buildings that are filled up. Historians say this is a cultural layer. Geologists say not a snowball's chance. These are some kind of deposits. Where and how the deposits came from, historians do not know, and geologists do not know either. Historians insist that these are geological deposits, not a cultural layer. Back in Soviet times, there was an anecdote. Here it is on the right. Radio Tbilisi reported that a wire had been found at the excavations, which indicates that the ancient Georgians had a telegraph. In response, the Armenian radio reported that no wire had been found. This indicates that the ancient Armenians already had wireless telegraph. This is to the question of whether the same findings can be interpreted in a mutually exclusive way. In addition to this, there were publications on the theme that archaeologists also joke. And archaeological jokes are expressed in the fact that if the excavations are carried out not up to the point where the area is completely cleaned up, and there is something left for future archaeologists, then you can throw something to them from the modern. When archaeologists, after a few centuries, poke around there and find a modern clock among the tools of the Stone Age, they will be in a big puzzle. After all, this also takes place, although not massively. Therefore, the question of the reliability of history, this is a question of how a person can enter the memory of the noosphere and read from there reliable information about what actually happened, how and by whom, for what purposes historical documents were falsified. And they were falsified directly. And among other things, there is such a tendency that if people commit some errors and abuses, and report the work done to their higher authorities, then they don't write that here we honestly saw the entire budget, and they either hide their errors and abuses, or present them as indisputable achievements for which they must be praised, patted on the head, bestowed with ranks and awards, and so on and so forth.
Представляют как неоспоримые достижения, за которые их надо похвалить, погладить по головке, одарить чинами и наградами и так далее и тому подобное. То есть ссылки
That is, references to documents do not at all mean that if, having raised a certain set of documents, we will get a reliable idea of what happened. When perestroika began, an anti-Stalin article was published in the Leningrad newspaper Smena, and one of the points on which Stalin was accused was that Stalin reproached historians. Historians do not use the opportunity to interview witnesses of events, but blindly believe the documents of the era, and this is not how it should be done. So, Stalin was reproached for this. It was in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it was about the events of the Great October Revolution and the Civil War. Then there begins an interesting thing. When the Great Patriotic War ended, a commission was created that was engaged in a simple matter. They interrogated the commanders, sole chiefs of military units, divisions of military units that were deployed in the first half of 1941 in the Western military districts. A survey was carried out on the theme: what orders did you receive? From whom? How were they carried out? To whom did you report? The commission did not complete its work in connection with the murder of Stalin, and its materials were classified. What could the commission have revealed? The commission could have revealed what is written about by Martirosyan. Martirosyan is a historian who specializes in the history of the Great Patriotic War, and he insists that the catastrophe of the summer of 1941 was conditioned by the fact that the troops were deployed not in accordance with Shaposhnikov's plan, but in accordance with Tukhachevsky's plan. And as a result, what happened happened. Who is responsible for deploying troops? Defense Minister and Chief of the General Staff. The Minister of Defense on the eve of the war is Marshal Tymoshenko. The Chief of the General Staff in the pre-war half-year is Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who is presented to us in the quality of Marshal of Victory, without whom Stalin would not have accomplished anything. And when Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, in one of his speeches or articles, hinted to Zhukov that if Zhukov behaved incorrectly, then the questions of actions of 1941 would be raised, and Zhukov began to behave correctly. Therefore, the question about what our history is, how it's reflected in the documents, and how to extract from these documents what actually happened, this is a separate theme. Now let's have a look. This is one of the last photographs of the Titanic. The Titanic has already embarked on her final voyage. Below is a computer reconstruction of what the bow half of the Titanic looks like at the bottom of the ocean. In the process of sinking, the Titanic broke in half, and its bow and stern ends at the bottom rest in different places. What is the problem? The problem is that 14 years before the real Titanic perished, Morgan Robertson wrote the novel Futility. The novel is on the internet in translation to Russian. This is pretty boring reading, so it's not a fun detective story or anything else. It's pretty boring. But among this tediousness, there is a steamer in which the Titanic is recognized. She was the fastest, the most luxurious, the biggest. She has 4 pipes, 3 propellers. In the maiden voyage, being inhabited by the richest people and the common people, she collided with an iceberg, received injuries incompatible with the ability to sail, and she sank. There weren't enough boats for everyone, and on top of that, the steamer was called the Titan. When the Titanic sank, Robertson was still alive, and somewhere there was a publication on the theme that when he was asked why he had Titan and not Titanic, he replied that he had a vision of a sinking ship. The perspective was from the stern, and the stern in plan is round, semicircular. There is an inscription on it with a name, and he read the name as Titan, since the last 2 letters were out of his field of vision. Well, again the question arises, how could this have happened that 14 years before the described events, the events have already been described? Is this an accident? That is, are there no cause-effect relationships in this? Or is there, after all, some cause that allowed Robertson to write such a novel? And here is another on the same theme. The magazine Arrangement and Repair, number 3463, 3rd to the 9th of September, 2001. The same ones are crossed out, the World Trade Center building. Then remember, there was also about the theme that if in Windows you enter the font Wingdings, all sorts of symbols, type a certain combination, then we will also get the perished Trade Center building. If we proceed from the fact that history is algorithmic, that is, history is an expression of psychodynamics. Psychodynamics of society, this is the result of the fact that everyone does what he wants, does not do what he does not want to do, and in the end, it turns out as it turns out. Well, if psychodynamics is the totality of the psyches of once living people, currently living people, then the psyche is an informational algorithmic system that determines the character of the interaction of each of us with other people, with the natural environment. Then a collective psyche is also formed. It carries a certain algorithmics of development, and if history expresses this algorithmics of development, then it's clear that Morgan Robertson could well have read down this dynamics, its algorithmics, from the noosphere, and described it in the novel. Since society did not change, then it built the Titanic and sank it in the way it was written by Morgan Robertson. But not because he is such an evil villain and dreamer who took up and wrote this, but simply because this algorithm already existed in the noosphere and truly could be read down. Well, the next question arises. If you can read down the algorithmics, and this algorithmics leads to some trouble, can you change it? Well, I've already talked about this. This is Herzen. Further, they still don't let us know history. The Russian government, as a reverse providence, improves for the better, not for the future, but the past. And in general, the ruling elite of any society does not need a reliable history. It needs a historical myth that allows it to justify its right to power and the duty of the rest of society to obey. Just look at what has happened even throughout our life. Now the task of historians is to spit on the Soviet era with truth, untruth, falsification of data, silence about some events, but in any case to spit on the Soviet era. The Soviet era was characterized by the fact that everything that was before 1917 was presented as an unquestionable negative and evil, from which the Bolshevik Party, on the basis of Marxism and Leninism, delivered the broad masses of people. And if you look into the historical past, then in general, it has always been the case that the ruling elite, one way or the other, falsified history, offering this or that cultic historical myth. Here are our days. Well, this is a genre when there is a picture on a black field. And on a black field, besides the picture, there is some kind of inscription. Now on the internet, they are called demotivators. And if the picture is on a bright blue background, then these are motivators. This here is an American demotivator related to the events of the 11th of September 2001. This is the Pentagon building after the fire. Someone from the Americans asks the question, where is the plane? That is, if any Boeing flew here, there should be the wreckage of a Boeing. Moreover, if the outer layer of the aircraft is a thin aluminium alloy, it can't really burn out, then frames, engines, something else should remain. All this is rather large, and this is absent here. In addition to this, the destruction zone is quite narrow, but the wingspan of the aircraft is about 40 meters. This is absent. This is what I showed you yesterday. Here is a view of Utoya Island. If Breivik is running along the shore, then these guys here are not visible to him. He can't shoot them. If he runs along the water's edge and even sees them, he's armed with the wrong weapon to be guaranteed to hit them. And if one of them hides behind the bushes, he again cannot shoot. And this here is the official route of Breivik. How he killed 67 people in an hour and a half on Utoya. If we believe in words, then we can believe anything. If we turn on the brain and start thinking, that is, drawing a cartoon, then we can see a lot of things that do not fit into the official version of events. And if we are also armed with the apparatus of probability theory and mathematical statistics, then we may have even more questions in relation to any unreliable historical myth, because the information reported in it generates other statistics, and not those that could have been or were. Further, the question arises about the descriptive categories with which we can describe the real historical process. Usually how? With the accuracy of the faceless crowd people and the leader. And such a tendency, it is really supported by the mass media throughout history to the present time. Because if you turn to what was before 1917, the king is God's anointed, and there is a crowd of more or less loyal subjects. Now we are analyzing the modern mass media. In the US, the president should take the rap for everything. In Russia, lately, Putin should take the rap for everything, and others allegedly have nothing to do with it. The next level of description. In a more complex version, a group of comrades appears who directly interact with the leader, the Tsar and his entourage, or as in our modern version, Putin and the cooperative Ozera, and all the rest have nothing to do with it. The next level, with the accuracy of certain social groups. The Marxist version of history. This is a history of class struggles. There is a place for personalities who make history and who are made by history. Associates of these personalities. And there are classes that carry their specific interests there and fight for the realization of them. But if you go deeper, then the crowd is not capable of self-organization. Classes and other social groups emotionally react to some events, but in some cases it can be traced that within social groups there are, in fact, mafia groupings that generate either political parties or church orders and some intrasocial formations, which in relation to the crowd act as an organizing and directing force. Such an approach leads to the fact that orders and other political mafias that hide from societies have their own legalized periphery. They generally do not act on their own, but they pursue quite determined political objectives that far from always coincide with these or those class interests. But class interests are used to realize these political objectives. This leads to the concept of conspiracy in history, and the analysis of conspiracies shows that on the one hand, there is a certain group of conspirators, but there is an intellectual trust that organizes this conspiracy. And in general, it turns out that descriptive categories form a kind of ordered structure.
Некая группа заговорщиков, а есть интеллектуальный трест, который организует этот заговор.
And everything at the end of the day leads to the fact that humanity in some way interacts with God and his opponents, interacts with extraterrestrial civilizations.
Приводит к тому, что человечество некоторым образом взаимодействует с Богом.
But history, being in these or those worldview positions, does not see much of this and does not want to see. Because if one of the historians touches on this theme, then the officialdom will be against it. Well, for example, the Red Wheel by Solzhenitsyn. If you read it, knowing or studying history for yourself, and not in order to pass a test or an exam, then it will become quickly clear that Solzhenitsyn knows what to keep silent about, because if he talks about this, then he will not be an outstanding writer, not an outstanding historian. And if he keeps silent about it, then there will be forces that are interested in just such a display of historical events. And, accordingly, so that everything would be good and that this view of history would sufficiently become widespread, a cult is built. Solzhenitsyn is a great writer, the Soviet of the nation, and so on and so forth. Although, in reality, he knew what to keep silent about in order to get publicity and prosperity, and he got it. Well, there was Vasily Osipovich Kluchevsky, one of the most intelligent historians of Russia in the second half of the 19th, early 20th centuries. Here are some of his aphorisms. In the quality of the content of history as a separate science, a special branch of scientific knowledge serves the historical process. That is, not a set, not a sequence of successive facts tied to time, but a process that has a certain internal dynamics, its own driving forces, and in which humanity, each nation, interacts with the environment. If we talk about the history of people, then not only with the natural environment, but also with the external political environment. So the story of the Titanic and other events, they show that history is really algorithmic. And in it, everything is conditioned by cause-effect relationships. We are now talking about this from the standpoint of the theory of algorithmics, theory of governance, programming. That is, from the standpoint of those disciplines that did not exist at the time of Kluchevsky. But if objective phenomena somehow exist and a person sees them, then he must also somehow describe them. And here Kluchevsky has an aphorism. The regularity of historical phenomena is inversely proportional to their spirituality. So, regularity in science is understood in such a way that if you create some conditions, these conditions affect something, and the result will be programmed by the impact of these conditions. That is, the repeatability of the result in the presence of certain conditions. According to this aphorism, history should repeat itself, and it repeats itself, but its repeatability is conditioned by spirituality. That is, if the spirituality of a society does not change, and spirituality is what I called psychodynamics. If the algorithmics of psychodynamics does not change, then history repeats itself like 2 and 2, always and everywhere. If psychodynamics changes, Nraviyasness, the world understanding of society, changes, the algorithmics of psychodynamics changes. And accordingly, something will be repeated, but something will change. And if there are very strong changes in psychodynamics, then the historical past will not repeat itself, but some new result will be obtained. And indeed, in the term spirituality, which was used by Kluchevsky in those days, the Nraviyasness of the comprising the era people, the creative potential of all of them, are hidden. And as a result, Kluchevsky asks the question, what do all these phenomena mean? What meaning in this chaos? This is the task of historical study. We cannot grope in the dark. We must know the power that guides our private and public life. That is, Kluchevsky posed the question of how the objective laws, to which the life of people is subordinate, are manifested in history. And the past must be known not because it has passed, but because, passing, it could not remove its consequences. And if we want a future, then we must ponder on what in the present is conditioned by the past and how, and we must egress from the cyclics of repetition of the same bad events that really take place in history. Well, there is such a thought that the present, this is a time when, by meaningful actions, it is possible to change the automatically inevitable future if we know the consequences of the past. And in this connection, pay attention to the fact that history has practically no memory of beneficial prophecies about the future. All prophecies about the future that history has preserved, these are prophecies of disasters. Why? But the answer to the question why cannot be understood if you do not know all this. This picture was also seen yesterday. There are objective laws. And there are governorial objective laws. Now, if we consider a situation where we have a certain self-governed object, and in relation to it, we perform control functions, and control functions assume that if the process of self-governance of this object flows somehow not the way that we would like, then we can intervene. Humanity is a self-governed system. There is the noosphere, a higher level of governance. There is God, the Almighty, the highest level of governance. And if we self-govern in a certain mode, and this very mode of our activity causes displeasure at higher levels, then a reaction is inevitable. The simplest reaction is to notify those who govern at our level that the process is heading towards catastrophe. If they accept this for fulfillment, somehow change the character of governance, then the catastrophe does not occur, and the prophecy of disasters becomes irrelevant. If they do nothing, then psychodynamics operates the algorithmics that lead to the catastrophe, and the catastrophe is realized. But if you don't know the theory of governance, then many things in history will simply be not understandable for you. It will be some kind of mystical bad luck or mystical good luck. For some reason, some are always lucky, while others, for some reason, are always unlucky. Britain has always been lucky from the 15th century. Russia has always been unlucky. In the primitive version, remember the film We'll Live Till Monday, the low-mark student says, and in general, Russia, after Peter the Great, had no luck with the Tsars. This is my personal opinion. Why was she unlucky? And you can't understand this if you don't master all of these tools. Well, since all societies are governed in some way, each person is also governed in some way, then if the historian is governarially illiterate, then he will not see governance where it is, and will write a lot of nonsense presenting the facts. But the facts will be reliable. But the conception of the historical past presented to society by him will be false or inherently deceitful. Therefore, you need to turn to how to form your governarial literacy. That is, we turn to the sixth group of objective laws, governarial objective laws.